After the overwhelming success of the 1996 video game Resident Evil, known as Biohazard in Japan, there was an almost immediate demand to take the game and adapt it to film. On the short list of directors to handle this was legendary horror director George A. Romero. I played a ton of Resident Evil back in the day, and when word got out that Romero might be directing an adaptation, I was ecstatic. He seemed like the obvious choice, being that he was the father of the modern zombie film, and the Resident Evil game series, at least partially, owed its existence to him. However, that movie never happened. The history behind this movie that almost happened is told in great detail in the new documentary, George A. Romero's Resident Evil. Up to this point, there were stories about what happened to the movie, but there was never a definitive look at what went wrong. The documentary starts with a focus on Romero's rise as a filmmaker, as well as everything that went into the creation of the first Resident Evil game. It's a fascinating, in-depth look at the two subjects. Initially, I was worried about the documentary because how do you make an almost 2-hour movie about a film that never happened? I mean, they never got past the scripting stages before the studio changed directions and Romero either left or was fired. Much to my surprise, they had tons of interviews with the people involved and an absolute treasure trove of archival articles that explain in great detail just about every facet of the almost production. I really enjoyed how they put in some new Resident Evil homage-style footage, reminiscent of the FMV segments from the game. I also loved how many of the interviews were told in dingy rooms on old CRT TVs. It gave the documentary a little something different. Sure, it was still a bunch of talking head interviews, but this helped them mix it up a bit. The other thing was, since they had so many archival articles, they injected them into the doc in the Resident Evil memo style. That is, instead of just reading them to the audience, they read them like the lore that you find in the games. It was a really nice touch and a way to deliver the info, but still keeping the audience engaged. They also covered the Romero Resident Evil 2 commercial for Japan, which was what led to him almost directing the film in the first place. As far as the interviews go, they had a bunch of Resident Evil experts, some of the actors from the FMV segments of Resident Evil 1, people who worked on the Japanese Resident Evil 2 commercial, and so on. They even had the original voice of Wesker doing all the narration. They drop a ton of info here, and I feel it would take at least 2 viewings to be able to absorb it all. In case you haven't figured it out, I did really enjoy this. Although I will give my one complaint. I did say that I liked the Resident Evil FMV style interludes. The only problem was that some of them felt overlong. They didn't really add much and just kind of padded out the runtime. I think they did a good job at matching the aesthetic of the old footage, but they could have been scaled back a little. Not a deal breaker, just the only real flaw in what I feel is a genuinely good doc. The whole thing is about 1:45, and aside from the Resident Evil homage footage, it's a non-stop barrage of Romero and Resident Evil history. Years ago, I was able to read a copy of Romero's script, and while it took some liberties with the game's story, I did feel he kept the spirit of the original alive. Lots of Easter eggs and many of the monsters from the original game. It was also insanely violent. They covered this in the documentary, that if the movie went into production at the studio, they would have had to dial the violence way back. The head of Constantine didn't like violence, which seems odd considering the property. They even showed his disconnect when he stated that the Resident Evil game isn't really all that bloody. You can find the script out there pretty easy these days if you want to read it. Granted, it was an early draft and these things often change, so who knows how it may have ended up if it ever went into production. Romero's script was much better than the original script that Constantine Films had before that, which they discuss quite a bit early on in the doc. They also touch on Paul W.S. Anderson's Resident Evil films, which I openly admit that I enjoy, except for the last one. They also talk about how Anderson got the job instead of Romero. I look at his Resident Evils as something that isn't a 100% adaptation, but more of a fun alternate universe type thing. George A. Romero's Resident Evil is a great documentary on a film that should have been made, but never was and never will be. Beyond looking at the source material, it's also a very loving tribute to one of the most influential horror directors of all time. The documentary is currently on video on demand, but I imagine it'll be streaming somewhere else in the coming months. If you're a Romero or a Resident Evil fan, or both, you'll enjoy this documentary very much.